This video here will be a little primer on psychohistory. According to Lloyd DeMau's psychogenic theory of history, much of the general flow of humanity can be explained through collective psychology, which can be divided into psychoclasses. And when you recognize that the idea of owning something is nothing more than a psychological construct based on the mutual agreement that yes, you own the shoes you are wearing, this is not very far-fetched. And since the state itself is a state of mind that has no more objective existence than your ownership of the shirt on your body, then the advance of history seems to me to be only explained through psychological terms. Now, not that economics doesn't matter. Certainly material reality can make or break individuals and determine the pace of psychological advancement or advancement through the psychoclasses. But on a macro level, history seems to be determined by this advancement. And if you spend a lot of time reading revisionist history, well, at least what I have found, is that so much of history involves just stringing together a narrative. It's a story that the historian gathers pieces of information to create a consistent narrative. The revisionist, what he'll do is he'll recognize that a lot of the facts were left out, and will typically write a new narrative that is far less shiny and story-like. And I've typically found revisionist history to be far less heartwarming, and it seems to point to the idea that there are no good guys or bad guys, just a mass of individuals pursuing their long-term self-interest. And wars are battles between these amoral clumps of people, with the victor painting the loser as something reprehensible. According to DeMau's, the progress of human history can be divided into 6 child-rearing modes, which produce various personality types, which in turn express themselves in political movements. Transition through the psychoclasses typically results in people who have exploited the fantasy of the previous psychoclass, leaving them high and dry. As in the emperor, who is maintained by nothing more than the various agreements as a result of the collective fantasy, for example, of the infanticidal psychoclass, he'll do whatever he can to forestall the dissolution of his empire. And so the march through the psychoclasses is bloody but inevitable. DeMau's analysis of psychoclass development is Eurocentric, which is okay for me because all I'm interested in is the model. And it varies considerably from area to area, so in reality, it varies considerably from area to area, but also in each area, it's actually a hodgepodge of different psychoclasses, and individuals themselves are typically intermediate between psychoclasses. So this model is necessarily simplified, or I guess you could say elemental. Right? We're describing the elements, not how they interact here. Yeah, a little bit how they interact, but more interested in the elements and the characteristics of each psychoclass and all that stuff. But all that said, here's the general timeline. The infanticidal mode of child rearing began in antiquity, going back into the jungle. So the first civilizations were made up of people in this psychoclass. About 300 years after the death of Christ, the abandoning mode of child rearing came into being. By about 1300, the ambivalent mode of child rearing began, and by 1700, the intrusive child rearing mode came into being. By around 1850, the socializing child-rearing mode came into being and is today the most predominant child-rearing mode. The helping child-rearing mode came into existence in around 1950. And note that just because a child-rearing mode comes into being doesn't mean it's predominant. Currently, the intrusive child-rearing mode is more prevalent than the helping mode. The infanticidal child-rearing mode is what came out of primitive tribal societies. So it's the genesis, and so its genesis was in a state of nature. But how the infanticidal child-rearing mode could come about escapes me. My working theory is that it came from using religion to rationalize killing a child for whom there wasn't enough food to feed. A parent had a child and then had another one, but couldn't raise the second child, so she killed it. She then explained to her older child that it had to do with gods or something. Again, that's just my theory of how this whole shitball got rolling. The parental wish of the infanticidal psychoclass is, I wish you were dead to relieve my fear of being killed by my mother. And so this manifested itself in lots of child sacrifice. As the infanticidal society became more complex, like Greece or Rome, this child sacrifice became ritualized and more abstracted. It became be called exposure, and they were doing it on altars and all sorts of stuff. In addition to this, sexual abuse was practiced and generally accepted. Okay, it wasn't even called abuse, it was just what people did. Homosexuality wasn't as widespread in Greece as people think. It was mainly having sex with children, and aside from genitalia, boys and girls are pretty similar at that age. There are boy brothels and rent-a-boy services in cities all over the classical Mediterranean, so much so that Plato proposed having all boys of a certain age be held in common. Aristotle's main objection to Plato's idea that children should be held in common was that when men had sex with boys, they wouldn't know if they were their own sons, which Aristotle says would be most unseemly. But that was about the extent of Aristotle's objections. Just think about that whenever someone cites Aristotle in a philosophical argument. Not that Aristotle wasn't brilliant for his time, it's just that his time has passed. Hardening was a common practice and began as early as infancy, where they would dunk infants in cold water to harden them, or make little kids run out naked in the middle of winter. They also terrified them with ghosts and magic, and yeah, all that bad stuff. Then came Jesus the Christ, the Son of the Lord, who died for your sins. He died, why? So you wouldn't have to. And marked the transition from the infanticidal to abandoning childbearing mode. Whether or not Jesus actually did what is said he did is irrelevant. If he didn't, some story would be made up in response to the new psycho class. Like they were going to make up some story about someone doing something similar to what Jesus did, dying for your sins and all that stuff. And the new psycho class was the abandoning psycho class, where the parental wish is, I must escape you, otherwise I may kill you. And so parents were typically very distant from their children, and swaddling came into practice, where the parent wrapped the baby up so it couldn't move. In this state, the baby very easily fell asleep and cried very little and required very little fussing around with. Or the parent oftentimes would simply abandon the child to a monastery or a nunnery, or send the baby off to a wet nurse. And of course, in the monasteries and nunneries, abuse was the order of the day. But believe it or not, it was still a significant step up from the psychotic child-rearing modes of before. So you could say that the abandoning parents were still infanticidal, but at least they knew that they were infanticidal. They knew they were screwed up and they knew it, and cared about their child enough to abandon it in some way. This is reinforced by certain passages of the New Testament as well, which say don't kill your children. But this new environment allowed for the development of the next child-rearing mode, the ambivalent mode. And in this, the parental wish is, you are bad for the erotic and aggressive projections I put into you. And of course, the reason the ambivalent parent projects these things is because that is how he was treated by either the parent or the priest in the monastery or the wet nurse or whatever. Because if a boy is raped in a monastery, he will be spun a story by the priest how he wanted it and that he was somehow responsible for it. It's a classic, blaming it on the victim. And so this person then grows up and has a child and continues the cycle of abuse. Though slowly it becomes less bad, and eventually the parents stop abandoning the child altogether, because the reasoning the abandoning parents did so in the first place was because they would have killed their children otherwise. Remember, this was the infanticidal psycho class, but the ambivalent parents were not infanticidal, and so they didn't need to abandon their children. And once this was figured out, they didn't abandon them. But of course, there's always a little bit of inertia. There's built-up institutions and all that crap, kind of like the state. And so they start raising their children themselves. For very young children, they would give enemas to purge out the nastiness, right? The aggressive and erotic projections they thought were in there, right? They thought all that smelly poo was like the aggressive and erotic projections that they needed to get out. They swaddled because it was convenient, though not nearly as much as before. Beatings were very common, as had been done to them, as the sexual abuse had been done to them as well. However, because they were not cloistered in monasteries or brothels like before, you basically had a pedastic relationship with the parent and the single child, and so the child was a singular erotic object, and this was a precursor to empathy for the first time in history. And mourning for the death of the child became common because parents began to see their children as actually being people. And if you think this is far-fetched of parents not seeing their children as actually being people, do you view a dog as actually being a person? And when you look at a dog as actually being a person, it's kind of a mind fart for a second. But and that's kind of like what it's like with children back then. Now, I don't want to make it out like the ambivalent mode of child rearing is a very loving time, right? It was not. Children raised in this way would be considered battered children today and would be taken away by child services. And of course, it'd be like you'd have the parent wailing, "Oh, but I love him so much and he loves me, and oh, please don't take him away." That's what it would be like. But that was the order of the day back then. And as much as I hate the state, that would be appropriate to have child services take the child away in that situation. The ambivalent mode of parenting was only good in relation to the nightmare that had existed before.